Hi everyone, thanks for joining me today. Today's book is called Helen's Big World, The Life of Helen Keller, and it is a biography. And a biography is a book about someone, a real person's life. And this biography was written by Doreen Rappaport, illustrated by Matt Tavares, and it's about the person, Helen Keller, who was just such an important figure in deaf history, blind history, and American history, really. She was really just an important and amazing person. And so Helen Keller was both deaf and blind, and she broke barriers, proving that people who are deaf, blind, or both can do amazing things. They can learn to communicate, they can advocate for their rights and for the rights of others, and she was an amazing speaker and just an advocate for rights all across the board. And we're going to learn a little bit about her in this book. So in this book, you'll notice some quotes that are in kind of a dark purple, and those are things that Helen Keller said herself. That's why they're in quotes here. So this is the first quote. It says, "We do not think with eyes and ears, and our capacity for thought is not measured by 5 senses." So she's saying we're not limited by our senses to think. We are larger than that. We can think and create beyond that. Helen gurgled and giggled in her crib. At 6 months she crawled and said, "Howdya" and "wah wah" for water. When she was 1, she ran after a ray of sunshine. She loved the mockingbird's song and the sweet smell of climbing roses, but best of all was being in her father's lap and in her mother's arm. So this part is a quote by Helen herself. It says, "The beginning of my life was simple and much like every other little life." So Helen was not born deaf and blind. When she was just a little tot, she could see and hear. When Helen was 19 months old, so that's just under 2, an illness her doctors could not name struck her. When she recovered, she could no longer hear or speak. When her parents pressed her close, she knew their smell and touch, but she could not see or hear them or say their names. And this is the quote from Helen. "In the dreary month of February came the illness which closed my eyes and ears. Gradually, I got used to the silence and darkness that surrounded me." So an illness took her sight and hearing. Helen tried to figure out her dark, silent world. She used her hands to recognize objects. She used her brain to make up signs, to let her family know what she wanted. Putting on pretend glasses meant father. Her hand on her cheek meant mother. But she could not make up enough signs to have her needs understood. Many times she screamed and kicked and ended up sobbing. Sometimes she hit the people she loved. This is a quote. "My failures to make myself understood were followed by outbursts." So here's a picture of an older Helen Keller kind of having a, maybe like we would call a meltdown, because she just couldn't convey her feelings, her needs. She couldn't communicate with the people around her, and that was very frustrating. When Helen was almost 7, Annie Sullivan came to teach her. Annie had been legally blind. After several operations, she could see again, but her eyes were still weak. Annie gave Helen a doll with her fingers and traced the letters DOLL in Helen's palm. Helen thought Annie wanted the doll back, so she kicked and screamed. Annie gave Helen some cake and traced C-A-K-E on Helen's palm. Helen traced the letters back on Annie's palm. Annie gave Helen many objects and spelled their names with her fingers. This is Helen's quote. It says, "I was interested in this finger play and tried to imitate it." Helen imitated Annie's finger movements, but she did not understand that she was spelling words or that things had names. So at this point, she was able to copy what her teacher, Annie Sullivan, was doing, but she didn't know what it meant. She didn't know that C-A-K-E meant cake. Helen liked the spelling game, but she didn't like learning table manners. She tried to eat with her fingers off Annie's plate. Annie wouldn't let her. Helen screamed and threw her spoon on the floor. Annie forced Helen to pick it up. Helen threw it on the floor again. Back and forth they went until Helen finally used the spoon and ate off her own plate. In the still dark world in which I lived, there was no tenderness. So before, Helen kind of just walked around and ate off anybody's plate. But Annie said, "No, we're going to teach you to use utensils and eat from your own plate." Do you think Helen liked it? I don't think so. One day, a month later, Annie pumped water into Helen's hand and spelled W-A-T-E-R in her other palm as Helen felt the cold water. She understood what Annie was spelling, the word water. Her face lit up as she spelled W-A-T-E-R on Annie's palm again and again and again. That living word awakened my soul, gave it light, hope, joy, and set it free. So she finally was making that connection between the letters Annie was putting in her hand and what they meant. See, you can actually see she's doing a W. So Helen can feel the water and spell and make that connection. This word that is being spelled means this, water. Helen touched the water pump. Annie spelled P-U-M-P, which spells pump, on Helen's hand. Then Helen touched Annie. Annie spelled T-E-A-C-H-E-R, teacher. For the next few years, Helen learned thousands of words and practiced speaking them with her fingers from the second she woke up until she went to sleep. So now that she knew the connection between finger spelling, W-A-T-E-R, and water, she could learn every word, everything she encountered. She could say, "What's that? What's that? What's that? What's that?" Just like children who learn to speak do. Annie also taught Helen to see with her fingers. Every day for many weeks, Helen touched a lily growing in a pot. She felt its pointy buds open and form silky blossoms. Helen smelled violets in Annie's hand and felt the warmth of the sun on her face. And Annie spelled each new word or idea. With her fingers, Helen felt the vibrations of a person laughing, a chick bursting out of an egg, a horse neighing, and a baby pig squealing. Annie spelled each new word or idea. Here's a quote from Helen. "There is not a talent or inspiration or joy in me that has not been awakened by her loving touch." So Annie taught Helen the world, basically. Everything that was going on. How to interact with the world despite not being able to see or hear. Annie placed paper on writing boards with grooves. She showed Helen how to guide her pencil with her left hand as she wrote in the grooves with her right hand. Once Helen learned to write, she would not stop. July 12th, 1887. Helen will write, "Mother, letter, Papa." Did not give Helen medicine. Teacher did give Helen peach. January 9th, 1888. Apples have no edges and no angles. Apples grow on trees. They grow in orchards. When they are ripe, they fall on the ground. January 29th, 1889. Astronomer comes from the Latin word astra, which means stars. When we are sleeping quietly in our beds, they are watching the beautiful sky through a telescope. The stars are called the Earth's brothers and sisters. Helen learned so quickly that some people called her a genius. Other people said Annie was a genius. Articles were written about Helen by the time she was 8. She was famous. So now that she could encounter writing and reading, she learned so much. And she was able to share what she was learning. What a gift that Annie taught her how to do that. Helen liked writing with a pencil. She loved when Annie spelled books to her, but she wanted to read books on her own. So Annie taught her Braille. Braille uses raised dots for letters and words. Annie put pieces of cardboard with raised dots on different objects. She spelled the words into Helen's hands as Helen ran her fingers over the dots and touched the objects. More dots, more words, practice, practice, until she read as quickly as sighted children. That's something people who are visually impaired still use today. Braille, it's a way of feeling the letters so you can read them that way. At first, I only had a few books in raised print. I'd read them over and over until the words were so worn and pressed I could scarcely make them out. So she just read them. There weren't many books in Braille, so she read the same ones over and over again. Annie took Helen walking in the forest, jumping in the salty ocean, tobogganing down snowy hills, bicycling in tandem, and sailing in a boat. She spelled out each new experience. Helen's quote says, "The wind rose and the waves chopped angrily. Our little boat swirled in the billows, only to be driven down with angry howl and hiss. Our hearts beat fast." Again, Annie is showing Helen the world, giving her all these experiences. Very few people knew manual language or finger spelling. So Helen learned to read lips. She put her middle finger on a person's nose, her forefinger on their lips, and her thumb on their throat, and felt their lips move as they spoke. At the same time, Annie spelled what they were saying. Practice, practice, until Helen could read lips. Helen touched a person's face and felt their lips and tongue vibrate. Then she touched her own lips and tongue and imitated what she had felt. Practice, practice, until she learned to speak. I can't imagine how difficult that was to learn, to get all the little nuanced movements, to feel people's lips moving, and then to learn it yourself. Helen was really dedicated and really showed how she could adapt to challenges. Her quote says, "It was my ambition to speak like other people. We worked hard and faithfully, yet we did not quite reach our goal." When Helen decided to go to college, most people said that would be impossible for her to keep up with the work, but she was determined. Annie sat next to Helen in class, spelling what the teacher said. Most of the books Helen had to read were not in Braille. For more than 5 hours a day, Annie read the books, spelled them to Helen, and she heard her eyes doing it. Helen graduated with honors. Teacher read many books to me, in spite of repeated warnings from oculists. Those are people who would be like doctors for your eyes. She has always abused her eyes for my sake. So Helen got to go to college, and Annie was there to help her. Annie was so dedicated to Helen's learning, wasn't she? While in college, Helen wrote her autobiography. She explained how Annie taught her. The book was a great success. People marveled at how much Helen knew and what a wonderful teacher Annie was. But some people questioned how Helen could describe things that she could not see or hear. They did not understand that she could smell the lilacs and the roses and feel the golden rays of sun on her face and the soft, springy earth under her feet. I have the advantage of a mind trained to think, and that is the difference between myself and most people, not my blindness and their sight. So she's saying, It's not my sight that made me so different. It's my ability to notice and think the world around me. Helen read all kinds of books and met all kinds of people and thought about all kinds of things and spoke about what was important to her. She spoke against war and against child labor. She spoke for workers' unions and the right for women to vote and the justice for Black Americans. Many people did not like her ideas. Helen believed that words brought freedom and she would not be silenced. Her quote is, "I do not like the world as it is, so I'm trying to make it a little more as I would like it." I love that she fought for the rights to show, or she fought to show people just what people with hearing or visual impairments can do. But she turned around and said, you know, I'm also going to fight for women's right to vote. I'm also going to fight for Black Americans and workers' rights. She fought for others, not just herself. And I find that really inspiring. Helen starred in a movie about her life. She didn't like that very much, but she did like being on stage. The audience asked questions. Annie spelled out the questions on Helen's palm, and Helen answered them. Sometimes Helen was funny. Does Miss Keller think of marriage? Yes. Are you propositioning me? She's basically saying, why? You want to marry me? Sometimes she was serious. Do you think women should go into politics? Yes, if they want to. Some people felt sad that Helen was performing, but she needed the money and she felt good earning it. And this sign says, introducing the eighth wonder of the world, Helen Keller. So they kind of were on stage to show people what she does, how she communicates. Oops. Helen traveled all over the world, giving talks on the needs of blind people. She spoke in people's homes and in large halls. She met with lawmakers and teachers and presidents. She insisted that eye doctors examine newborns. She insisted that there be more books in Braille and better education and meaningful work for people with disabilities. Her quote says, "The chief handicap of the blind is not blindness, but the attitude of seeing people towards them." For 49 years, Annie was at Helen's side, wherever she went, helping her do things she could not do by herself. Annie's health weakened, and she died when Helen was 56. I often wonder what my life would have been like if she had not come into it. Polly Thompson was there to help Helen, but some people wondered how Helen would survive without Annie. So Annie was such an important part of Helen's story. Helen used the strength and the knowledge that Annie had taught her to face the world. She kept traveling and speaking, always saying what she thought was important, until she died at the age of 87. I love my country, but my love for America is not blind. Perhaps I am more conscious of her faults because I love her so deeply. She's saying, I love America, but I want it to be better. And I believe it can be better. So here's the notes from the author and illustrator on their connection to this book and a timeline of Helen Keller's life. Some resources and where other books and things to read if you want to learn more about Helen Keller. I know that was a long one today, but there was just so much to learn and appreciate about this incredible person, Helen Keller. Thank you for staying with and reading with me today. I hope you have a wonderful day. See you soon. Bye.